Working together to make a better community.
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Karen Messing, Professor Emerita from the University of Quebec at Montreal. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Karen, I know you just have a new book out. I'm a big fan. I need to kind of share that with my audience right now. I love the work you've done, and I'm so happy to have you here as a guest on the show. Before we start talking about the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background.
Well, I guess I have to own up to being an American, although I've been in Canada since 1965. I went to school at McGill. I originally was studying fungal genetics. That's genetics of mushrooms and slimy things. And it took me a long time to realize that people were more interesting. And once I became a professor of biology, my university, the University of Quebec, has a rather unusual situation. It has an outreach office that connects professors with the community, and union groups, women's groups, community groups, environmentalist groups can ask for the services of professors to help them out with anything that they need, whether it be training or research. And in that context, I got involved with some labor unions who were having health and safety problems. And they got me working on those problems, and I found that much more interesting than slime. So I have been doing research for the last 40 something years on occupational health and safety.
So, Karen, one of the things that I really like about your work is that interaction with the actual workers and with the organizations that are supporting them and working with them, like unions and community groups. And that experience, I think, has really helped inform your work. And for me, it's made it more real, more kind of down to earth. Can you tell me a little bit about, you mentioned that the University of Quebec, it's kind of got a unique program around that. Not all universities do that kind of thing. Can you tell us just a little bit about that, and from your angle, what impact has that kind of special program had for you?
Yeah, the program, I haven't seen another one exactly like it. Some other universities have outreach programs, but what's special about ours is because the faculty is unionized with the Confederation of National Trade Unions, which is a real union, it's not just professors in it. The agreement that we have provides resources for the professors that are involved in community driven research. And what that means is that if somebody wants me to do research, there's seed money to start the research. If somebody wants me to do training, I can get course relief. So instead of teaching undergraduates for 15 hours, I can teach in unions for 15 hours. So there's actual real money given to this idea of serving the community. And because of that, people like me I knew nothing about unions, nothing about workers. Although my parents grew up poor and did hard jobs when they were young, by the time they had kids, we were living in the suburbs, and my parents were. My mother was teaching, and my father was being a multinational vice president of a corporation. So I never really had any contact with unions at all until I got to the university, which is kind of funny. And therefore, the first time I was asked to provide expertise in an occupational health and safety context, I I just had no idea what I was seeing. I was flabbergasted. For example, we were called in by a union that was exposed to radioactive dust, and I went out to the plant with the union coordinator, and I couldn't breathe because there was so much dust, and it was radioactive, and I could feel it going into my body, and I went, oh my goodness, they're not kidding about this occupational health stuff. So it was an important educator for me. Yeah.
And so you talk about a little bit in your book how you kind of transitioned from kind of that genetic part of biology into kind of that, I would maybe say, the whole body, the whole person view that I guess we might call ergonomics. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, in the beginning, when I was doing genetics is a laboratory science. I was looking at the actual DNA of uh, yeast, actually, and doing laboratory manipulations. And in the factory where there was the radioactive dust, we needed to know whether the workers were being hurt by it. So I first tried to find some laboratory way of examining their genetic materials to see what was happening with it. Um, Over the following few years, I was examining the DNA of a lot of people who were exposed to a lot of things. And because of the way we were working with the unions, I got to meet a lot of people. And one of the people I met was a cleaner. And yes, they were exposed to all the toxic things that there are in hospitals, but she was also telling me about job cuts in her job and how it was driving everybody crazy, and they were all trying so hard to clean, but you couldn't clean in the time that was allowed, and she was worried about the patients, and she was worried about her own health. And the more she talked, the more I got this feeling that I should really widen my perspective on work and not just think about poison. uh, it's not like poison isn't important, but people hurting all the time and going home hurting is important too. So I went to France, where they specialize in a more holistic and more global view of work, and they taught me ergonomics. And the first people I studied were actually cleaners in France. They were the people who cleaned trains. And since then, I've done a number of studies of cleaners and how hard that work is, and how much cleaning is forgotten by the people who organize. Well, if we take hospitals, and supposing we take hospitals right now in the middle of COVID, um, who's when we talk about who's exposed to COVID, people hardly ever talk about the cleaners, and yet they spend an awful lot of time in the rooms of people with COVID. And if you look at their blood, which I haven't done, but other people have done, they have as much COVID exposure in their that we can find in their blood as more than doctors, about the same as nurses, and almost as much as nurses' assistants. So they're really exposed. Plus, they're exposed to all the toxic things. And plus, the most important thing, I think, is that they're exposed to people not thinking about them, and they're exposed to invisibility. And invisibility is a pretty painful thing when you're working very, very hard and nobody can see you. And so, for example, when the hospital administrators buy equipment, when they organize hospital rooms, they never consult the cleaners. They never think about cleaning. So they buy things that have little corners in them where all the dust accumulates, and then the cleaners are cursing them. But they never see the cleaners, so they don't know the cleaners are cursing them. So it was a gradual thing for me to expand my perspective on work, and to realize that you have to think about many, many different kinds of work, many different effects of work, and many different kinds of people.
And so the dynamics of coming to that understanding um, seems to me to be facilitated by seeing workers as something beyond a research subject. That you were given more time, kind of institutionally through your organization, to develop relationships with workers and in a way have interactions with them maybe beyond what would normally be seen as a research data collection. Would that be accurate?
Well, ergonomists in general, at least those trained in that French tradition and that trained me, we would typically spend about 100 hours per project observing work. Because the thing we do is we want to see how people do it, not how they say they do it, or not how somebody else thinks they do it, but how they, honest to gosh, do it. And most workers, in order to do what they are supposed to be doing and in order to protect their own health, they have to do a lot of adaptations. And they don't usually tell you about them because they're not part of what they're explicitly being paid to do. So if you watch people for hours and hours, you're going to learn a lot. And if you need to understand what they're doing, then you need to ask them, and people will tell you what they're doing. So I guess that puts us into closer contact with real work than certainly than when I was in the laboratory. But even if I was administering questionnaires, I still wouldn't be listening to workers as much as we do. And then the other thing that we're supposed to do, and I have an example about that in the book, when we were working with the people, the PSWs, I think you call them in Ontario, personal support workers in hospitals. And we were doing a study because the workers were telling us that when they changed the job titles from women's PSWs and men's PSWs, okay, there were two kinds of jobs with patients, and they were divided by gender initially in the 60s and 70s. And then at some point, the union succeeded in getting the job indiscriminate, or to desexing it, if you like, so that it was one job title, which was PSWs, and they would be either men or women, and they were supposed to do the same job. But when I was doing a training session with them on musculoskeletal disorders, on aches and pains, they were telling me it's not fair. The men and the women are supposed to be doing the same things, but anytime it's really heavy, the men do it, and it's unfair to the men. And the men were saying, yes, we're getting older and we can't do it anymore. So we said, okay, we'll do a study and we'll document that, and we'll see what has to be done about it, because it seems to be unfair. So we go in and we observe for over 100 hours. And what do we see is that the women are doing 50% more of the heavy work than the men. So this was a little bit of a surprise for us. And then, but our philosophy is, and our practice is, that when we find this kind of result, we go back to the workers and we say, well, what do you think about this? So we did. We had a meeting with all the workers, men and women, and we said, well, here's what we found. And they said, you're crazy. We don't believe you. And we showed them the numbers, and they said, well, you're wrong. And it was quite interesting, because what we learned from this exchange was a number of things. One thing we learned was that the women PSWs were feeling that they had to work really hard because it was unfair to the men if they didn't. So they were exhausting themselves. The other thing we learned was that we were counting. Okay, so we observed 100 hours, maybe, and I'm forgetting the numbers, but maybe we observed about 1,000 actions, specific actions of heavy physical labor that we were categorizing. Is it men? Is it women? Is it men helping women? Is it women helping men? Did the nurse ask a man or a woman to do this task, etc.? We were cataloging all that. But so that the massive data said the women were doing more, but every so often, 3 times in the 1,000, there was something that was really awful. It was a really hard thing. There's a patient, a big, heavy patient falling out of their chair, and somebody's got to catch that patient. There's a person who has some mental health challenges going berserk, and somebody's got to go after that person and catch them. And in those 3 extreme situations, people did call on men. And so the people were not crazy saying that the men were doing more than the women, but it was all kind of getting balanced out. And what was visible was the men being in danger. And what was invisible was what all the women were doing. So that listening combined with looking, combined with spending a lot of time, really gives you a much fuller picture. And then we could make better recommendations. So one of the recommendations was, for example, that people work in pairs. Teamwork is something that people who organize work don't often think about. But if you could organize the work in patient rooms in one of 2 ways. You can organize the work by giving rooms 1 to 6 to Mary and rooms 7 to 12 to John. Or you can give John and Mary rooms 1 to 12. And we were recommending the second option because that way they can work things out together and they can get to know one another, and each one will have their favorite patient and each one will have their favorite thing that they like to do. And one of them likes giving baths and the other one likes feeding or whatever. So we were able to be a lot smarter about this by watching the workers, listening to them, asking them questions, and getting their feedback.
This is such a refreshing way to think about research, that oftentimes isn't integrated. Just in the first chapter of your book, you're also talking about women who were working in a male-dominated industry as electricians or along that line, and how, as you pointed out with the cleaners or with the PSWs, we oftentimes don't recognize that larger environmental understanding. Oh yeah, men do the heavier lifting, but in fact, that may not be the case. We form these assumptions, and your book in a way is talking a lot about, I think, some of those broader assumptions about the differences between men and women, and how that kind of plays out in terms of the dynamics at work. You've been doing this for 40 years. You know, in 40 seconds, obviously more than 40 seconds, but what are some of the highlights along the way that you want to share with others?
Well, in 1982, I wrote a paper that was called "Do Women and Men Have Different Jobs Because of Their Biological Differences?" And in it, I said, well, they're not that different, and so they shouldn't really have different jobs. I said it in a more scientific way because it was published in a scientific journal. And I've been thinking about that question for a long time because I don't know if people are aware of it, but you could become aware of it just looking around you. There are very profound differences in the labor force between men's jobs and women's jobs. That is, if you were going to spread men and women evenly across the labor force, across jobs, across professions, you would have to, about half of workers would have to change jobs. Okay, there's such a division right now that to smooth it out, you'd have to have a lot of people changing jobs. And if you look at the top 10 jobs done by women, which are things like teacher and kitchen help, wait staff, that kind of thing. Among the top 10 women's jobs, there are only 2 that are among the top 10 men's jobs, for example. top 10 men's jobs last time I looked was truck driver, and the top woman's job is still clerk, secretary. So it's a very profound division, and it has profound implications for health. And the question I was asking is why is this? Why is there this division? Is it because women and men can only do different things? And I think that it's better, as I was writing this book, I came to believe that what really happened is that historically certain jobs were only done by men, and that was most jobs, because women up until about 40 years ago were pretty much of a minority in the paid workforce. So most jobs had evolved in relation to a male clientele. What does that mean? It means that they could be done by big, strong people. It means that they could be done by people who didn't necessarily have to stop working at 5 o'clock and go get their kid from the daycare. It meant a certain kind of work organization that wasn't maybe natural. Maybe the guys would have liked to go to the daycare at 5 o'clock, but the way that the work was set up at that time, this was the way it was set up. So when women entered the workforce and in larger numbers, the work didn't change, and women were being asked to adapt to the old way of doing things. And the tools were made for male hands, and the heights of counters. I always laugh because the heights of kitchen counters are made in relation to male bodies. The height of the cart that the hotel cleaner pushes around on the rug, and it's a resistant rug and she's having a hard time pushing it. The height of the handle on that cart is set at 70% of the shoulder height of the average European male. And if you can find me a European male doing that job, I will give you a prize. So you have to think about what would be necessary for the workplace to be adapted to women's lives, to women's physical aptitudes. And then as an occupational health professional, you have to think about what more do we have to know in order to know how to protect women and men equally. And there's so many things we don't know, because women are not that different from men, but there are differences. There are hormonally induced differences in reactions to certain toxins, and we can't pretend they don't exist. So what does that mean?
For me, as a man with a disability, having lost my left arm years ago in a construction accident, this is so reminiscent because rarely are people with disabilities kind of factored into the equation as well, and so I feel like, in a way, by focusing on the gender kind of differences, it's also kind of shining a light on there are more differences as well, in whether men or women. But and my hope is really part of that impact of noticing that there's differences and we need to deal with things differently will benefit people like me as well as women in the workforce.
Yeah, it's a tricky business, and I'm sure you're aware of it, because if you when you think about differences, um, we have a kind of a human tendency to think better and worse. And
Right.
so you have to be careful when you talk about differences, that you're not creating a situation where people are being looked at as inferior or superior. And I'm thinking now also about racialized populations, because one of the things I was doing when I was looking in to write the book was trying to look at populations in terms of size, strength, and dimensions. and I could just hardly find anything on racialized populations, on racialized populations other than white European populations, and mostly about men. Like, if you want to know why NASA was unable to find to design spacesuits for women, the data just aren't there. The data aren't there for white women. They aren't, and they sure aren't there for black men, for black women, for Asiatic men and women. It's really, really hard to find any data. And you have to think about what's the mentality where somebody wouldn't think this was important. And so if you think about people with various disabilities, because I don't know what the figures are, maybe you do, Steve, because you know more about this than me, but probably a majority of the working population is disabled in one way or another. And we don't have any information on that either. I mean, I can't think of a study that I've seen that really characterizes human working population.
So, Karen, we're almost out of time. I want to come back to the book, Bent Out of Shape. I want to say that as I've started to read it, I can recommend it to a wide audience. It's not just an academic book. It's not just for academics or scientists, but it's about us as people, and more specifically about women, and our own kind of journeys of understanding and grappling with these issues. I really want to thank you for writing the book and bringing it out and talking to me today. Any last thoughts in the last 30 seconds or so before we have to call quits?
Well, I just do want to bring attention to the subtitle, which is Shame, Solidarity, and Women's Bodies at Work, because I want to mention about shame, which I started the book thinking about the shame I have felt and often feel about my own body, and about things that have happened to me and things that I've done or things that I've been unable to do. And the Me Too movement made me more aware of the necessity to combat any shame about being women, and the necessity to become to work out ties with other women and men, so we can advance women's health at work. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
So, Karen, if people want to find out more, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, they could read my book. They could buy my book. They could send me an email at messing.karen@uqam.ca. I would love to hear from people who've read the book and see what they think about it. And if anything they think that I wrote wrong, they should let me know right away.
Once again, Karen, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your journey and about the book. And once again, I encourage folks to check it out, find the book. It's Between the Lines is the publisher. In terms of our future shows, we're always looking for your ideas in terms of topics and guest speakers. You can check us out on Facebook. Look for Community Conversations. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. And please stay safe and keep the faith. We'll make it through this darn pandemic. Thanks again, Karen.
Working together to make a better community.